So with the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, it has sent a lot of people into a bit of a frenzy over, was this the right choice? Was it the wrong choice? Is he a hero? Is he a terrorist? There's so much going on out there. And we thought we'd bring some grounding to this discussion, explore it in multiple different ways, and see if we can find a bit of a unifying message. So here to help break this down is going to be legal expert David Helfrich. And we're going to talk about sort of strictly the legal side of this, and then get a little bit into a commentary on the social side and the social exploration. Welcome, David. What do we got here when it comes to specifically the legal side? Because I know a lot of people are not quite understanding the law here. So why don't we start there in breaking this down?
For sure. Good to be with you, Joe. Good day to everybody at the Pulse. So this case brings out a lot of questions and controversy. Certainly, there's a lot of complexity when it comes to the social analysis at play here. But with regards to the legal analysis, it's actually less complicated and pretty straightforward as it pertains to the self-defense claims. So in Wisconsin, as with most states in the United States, the burden is actually on the prosecution to disprove a self-defense claim. So it's not the burden of the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse here, and his legal team to prove that he acted in self-defense. It actually lies on the prosecution to affirmatively disprove that he did not act in self-defense, which is the highest burden we have in our criminal justice system. And you want it to be that high because you do not want the state to come in and just sort of frivolously be able to convict somebody. You want them to have to meet that high burden. So here, I think most legal experts looking at this weren't surprised at the verdict when it comes to the self-defense claims, because the fact patterns here and the evidence that was available showed very classic self-defense fact patterns as it pertains to Rosenbaum. And, I think Anthony Huber a little bit less clear, but still nonetheless, the prosecution really did not meet its burden to the point where it was able to convict him. And I think what I want the viewers to understand here is that when we're looking at the standard of guilt here, the standard of proof, what the jury is instructed to look at is whether someone in the position of Kyle Rittenhouse or a reasonable person in that position believed that their life was in danger of death or grave or serious bodily harm. So obviously the jury here believed that Rittenhouse did act in self-defense based on a reasonable belief. And also it's important to note here the age of the defendant, who was 17. They're also looking at a 17-year-old boy who's in that situation, who we can argue about whether he made a bad decision to be in that situation in the first place. But that's not what was on trial here. What was on trial was, did he act in self-defense? And based on the facts, based on this, by the way, a wholly subjective standard, it's charged for everyone in the jury to actually come up with a subjective standard on their own as to whether the defendant here acted in self-defense based on a reasonable belief that his life was in danger. That's what was at play here from a legal perspective. And that's why most people who are following this, who are familiar with our criminal justice system, were not surprised that he was acquitted on those charges.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll get into this a little bit later too, but looking at the total video footage that is available, it does seem fairly obvious, from a reasonable point of view that he was operating in self-defense. However, I know there was another charge with a weapons charge that was actually thrown out in this case. And I know there's a lot of confusion as to how that weapons charge could have been thrown out. Can you break that down as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a little concerning to me, just in terms of the conduct of the judge here, Judge Schroeder. So under Wisconsin law, anyone under 18 who possesses a dangerous weapon is guilty of a misdemeanor, punishable up to 9 months in prison. It's not a huge charge. Again, it's a misdemeanor. But obviously Rittenhouse carried an AR-15 to this rally and killed 2 people with it. What's interesting here is that under Wisconsin law, again, and this was based on a 1991 statute that defined a minor carrying a deadly weapon based on the size of the barrel. Really, this law was intended to curb gang violence and prevent people from carrying sawed-off shotguns, right? But what's confusing here is that if Rittenhouse showed up to the rally with nunchucks, for example, he would have been found guilty under the statute of carrying a deadly weapon. But because he's carrying an AR-15 based on the size of the barrel, the judge threw this out, which I think was a surprise to a lot of people. However, the judge didn't incorrectly throw this out based on a technicality. Technically, he was correct to throw it out. And the defense team they're doing their job, right? They're trying to get their client off of everything. So they're smart to try to find this loophole in the law. However, by throwing this out, this really contradicts the spirit of the law. The intention of this law was to prevent minors from carrying a deadly weapon into a situation like this. So, I think that while it's understandable that he was acquitted on self-defense, what's hard for a lot of people to understand is, how did he get off on this when so many people are sitting in prison simply for carrying a weapon illegally? And he carries an AR-15, clearly contentious and provocative manner.
Yeah.
And that gets thrown out as well. So, the conduct of the judge here, I do think the judge showed a lot of bias just in terms of his overall demeanor and his overall deference that I think he gave to Rittenhouse. And this was an example of that. But it is also important for people to know that this statute is poorly written. The Wisconsin legislature, they need to revise the statute and modernize it. So it's not necessarily the fault of the judge here. He's basically construing this statute in a technical manner. But I do think he ignored the spirit and original intention of this law by doing so.
Yeah, so let's understand that a little deeper when we're talking about the technicality of the law versus the spirit of the law. Is it within the judge's decision? Like, could he have, within his bounds, gone with the spirit of the law and said, you know what, look, I think this law is a bit poorly written, so I want this charge to kind of be considered by the jury. Does he have the freedom to do that?
Absolutely. He has the judicial discretion to do that. And there's really been a sort of a tension throughout our jurisprudence that looks at both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And the aim of a judge and really our judicial system is to balance those two factors so that we're really ascertaining the original intent and meaning and purpose of why a statute is construed the way it is. Yeah. So he did have that discretion. He decided to throw it out. I think it would have been interesting to let the jury decide this.
Yeah.
And I think it's likely that the jury would have found him guilty if they are accurately interpreting the law, understanding the intent and the spirit of the law to prevent minors from carrying deadly weapons into a situation like this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even in my own analysis, so this is my perspective here, when I watched the tapes, when I watched what was going on, and I had not had knowledge of the way that law was written, I was saying to myself, you know what, he's obviously acting in self-defense, but I feel like this guy should maybe some community service, or to carry a gun into a situation like that seemed weird. So with what you're saying, I'm like, I'd probably on the jury have been like, yeah, maybe this charge should stick, right? Just with my opinion here. But I guess one of the questions that's coming up with a lot of people is, would, let's say, a person of color, do you think, and obviously this is just completely opinion, we're having a conversation here, but it's like, have had that same opportunity to have that charge thrown out. And just correct me if I'm wrong here, but the charge regardless wouldn't end up with prison time or anything like that. Like the penalty would have been minor, but I guess the question still remains, would there have been a different situation with a person of color? I think a lot of people are asking that question.
100%. And that's where I think a lot of people are struggling to process this, because we've seen situations across the country in the United States where Black men, Arab men are in a similar situation. They don't get the benefit of the doubt that Rittenhouse got in this case.
Yeah.
So there is certainly a disparity with how our law is adjudicated. That is a huge problem. That's a social problem that we have to deal with as a society. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that also doesn't mean that Kyle Rittenhouse was guilty of homicide or murder in this case.
Right.
I think we have to balance both of these ideas in our mind at the same time. So, you have people on one side who think that Kyle Rittenhouse is a hero, right? And somebody who should be lauded, and people are sending him new AR-15 rifles and basically making him a champion of self-defense and a champion of the right. And then you've got other people who are saying he's a terrorist who should be in prison for the rest of his life. And these are really opinions that are based on ideological divisions that are so deep in our country.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at this, I think from a more balanced and a sober perspective, we can understand that Kyle Rittenhouse did make a viable self-defense claim under Wisconsin law, and that there are other defendants, particularly people of color, who also, under the same fact patterns, don't get the same benefit of the doubt in our legal system.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think most of us who have taken a pretty balanced perspective, and maybe I'm stepping too far here in saying this, but I would say most of us who've taken that perspective would probably say that, look, there's racism in the United States, in the world, in different places. There are gender inequality issues in the United States and the world. But my challenge is as much as I see and I recognize those, I feel like instead of talking about and trying to solve those particular issues, we're coaxed into extremism, which actually I think pulls us away from the issues. So like in this case, well, let's call Rittenhouse a terrorist. He's a horrible, horrible man who's a murderer. And it's like, well, hold on a second. The actual issue that we should be focused on is, he had this weapons charge thrown out, which, yes, it wouldn't have ended up in jail time. He probably would have had probation, I think, like you've alluded to. But we take away from that more meaningful discussion by delving into extreme ideological ideas. And I'm wondering, like, do you think we need the extremism to have a discussion about anything? Is there any place for balance here?
Well, I don't think there is when we're in an environment where there's such media malpractice. I mean, based on the coverage in the United States, you had major outlets in the UK and Brazil thinking that the defendants were Black. They were reporting that that the victims in this case were Black. They were literally reporting that, and they also were reporting that Jacob Blake is dead and he's still alive. So if we can't get these basic facts correct, then what chance do people have to understand the nuances of the legality in this case? But I think this charges us to try to resist our initial biases. Like for me personally, I'm not sympathetic to Kyle Rittenhouse. Like I've seen him posing with Proud Boys, using certain hand gestures. I think he's probably a silly, immature kid who was radicalized in the moment. But that doesn't mean I think he should have been found guilty based on the fact pattern here.
Yeah.
When it comes to the homicide charges, and I think I would challenge those people who want him locked away to throw away the key. I would say, well, what if a Black man or an Arab man was carrying an AR-15 into a MAGA rally? Somebody attacked him and he shot them in self-defense. Would you have the same opinion, right? Or would your opinion shift based on your ideological division?
Yeah.
And that's what we have to keep in mind here, particularly when we're looking at the law, because I do think that the precedent can be potentially dangerous when it comes to inspiring more vigilante acts. Mm-hmm. But what we don't want is a vigilante court that's basically finding people guilty, and we're not forcing the prosecution to meet its high burden to overcome the presumption of innocence that every defendant should have. But every defendant, meaning regardless of whether they're Kyle Rittenhouse or Jacob Blake, every defendant in our legal system has to be given that presumption of innocence. We haven't had that in the United States, which is why I think you're seeing a lot of frustration with the verdict. But we do have to get to a point where we're analyzing this objectively in the middle of the road, and then we're having the sort of the tangential social discussions that are important to have.
Yeah. And, this goes back to the discussion of like the media, like you said, a lot of people that I know who were having a really, really difficult time with this case. And so I didn't personally, not in my circles, not in the people, I didn't see a lot of people claiming that he was a hero, although I know that exists. I've seen it a little bit on Twitter. I've seen it on Fox News. Oh, he's a hero, he's a hero, he's a hero. But I didn't speak to many people that were like that. Most of the experience that I had looking with people is they were like, when I actually saw the full videotapes, I realized he was innocent in terms of the homicide and the murder. But when I was watching the way the media, especially, New York Times, Washington Post, Huffington Post, The Intercept, I even seen a few pieces, the way they made things look was very, very different than what actually happened. And it goes into this thing of, we always hear that fake news is this massive problem that has these massive implications on society. And I've found over the course of my journey is that the mainstream media is doing the exact same thing, even though it's not quote unquote fake news. They're tailoring stories that have massive cultural implications on people. My question here is, ultimately, it's like, and I think you kind of brought this up, is the idea of media malpractice. Like, how much of the media coverage really enraged people to not understand this from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it had a lot to do with it. And, what I observed, what was interesting here is that you didn't see a lot of photos of the victims here. I think if you ask most people to identify a photo of Rosenbaum or Anthony Hubert, the two men who were killed here, they probably wouldn't know who they were.
Yeah.
I think, you saw more photos of Jacob Blake, or if you look at a different case, the Ahmaud Arbery case, we know his photo. It's been all over the news as the clear victim in that case. But here, I think that there's always this tendency to stoke the racial divisions in this country. And I think people were looking at this, and a lot of people were thinking that, Rittenhouse was going and just indiscriminately killing people of color, but that's not the case here.
Yeah.
And, Anthony Huber, by the way, and another point I want to bring up is that a lot of people are saying these were bad guys. They should have been killed.
Yeah.
And to me, this is a deprived perspective, because if you value life, just because somebody's a bad person, in your opinion, doesn't mean they should be executed.
Yeah.
Like, some people were saying George Floyd was high on drugs and used a counterfeit bill. That doesn't mean he should have been executed by Derek Chauvin.
Absolutely.
Rosenbaum clearly had a troubled past, was probably a bad guy based on, if we just look at his criminal background. But Anthony Huber was just somebody who knew Jacob Blake and, wanted to demonstrate he had a skateboard. Was this a bad guy? I think that people have to kind of separate their own personal views here based on whether they think somebody is, Antifa or MAGA or whatever they think people are aligned with, and value life regardless. So I think that, the challenge everyone's having here is we so quickly want to retreat to our tribal identities when something like this happens. And it prevents us from having meaningful discourse to where we have a sense of value and dignity for each other's lives, regardless of the circumstances at play. And unfortunately, that's lost here.
Yeah, and I think you're alluding to what Candace Owens said there, right? About how, it's almost like Anthony Huber was a bad man. He was convicted for child sex crimes, and therefore he deserved to die, or it was okay for him to die, that sort of thing, which then removes the whole concept of rehabilitation, the whole concept of can humans improve? Like, if we're going to live in a society where we believe nobody can ever change, I don't think that's necessarily a good ideology to accept, because then it means that we're always going to be stuck with what we got, and I just don't believe that personally for humanity. I think we can improve in a lot of different ways, but I think you hit it on the head there at the end. It's just really, this comes down to, what do we want? Do we want a more divided? Do we want a more aggressive? Do we want a more ideological world, or do we want a world that is more grounded, that is having more meaningful discussions? And I think what you're saying is ultimately we have to be able to drop the ideology and look at the facts and sit there with that, even if it's uncomfortable.
100%. And just a point of clarification, it was Rosenbaum who was convicted of the child sex offenses. Huber had some legal history as well.
Right.
Like, he wasn't convicted of that, just out of respect for him and his family. I know that wasn't his background, but to your point, 100%. And by the way, that concept of rehabilitation also has to be extended to somebody like Rittenhouse. People have to keep in mind that maybe this person can be improved and have more sympathy and empathy for people who he opposes ideologically after this traumatic experience.
Yeah.
I think in furtherance of justice, it probably would have been a better outcome if he was at least found guilty of the, possession charge, or maybe even reckless endangerment. I think the fact that he got off scot-free is what a lot of people, it's hard for people to process. But again, you have to look at the legal elements of the case, and it was pretty clear from a self-defense standpoint.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's a lot to play with here. Again, I think there's a whole other discussion that could go down in terms of race and really discussing some of what's playing out, but it would end up being quite a long video. I appreciate everything that you brought to the table here in this discussion. Hopefully it helps to, just kind of bring a little bit of a unifying message here.
Indeed. Good to be with you, Joe, and thanks for having me on today.
That's all.